Did you know that Martin Luther never nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door? That Roman Catholics are fellow Christians? And that the Reformation was a tragic mistake that must be reversed at all costs? Yes, this and more we'll talk about in today's video update. I've titled it, Fake News MSM versus the Reformation. Hi, this is Steve Matthews here. And I'm kind of getting to this Reformation video maybe a little bit late. Of course, obviously, Reformation Day was this past week. I was out of town last week. I was actually at the Trinity Foundation Reformation Day conference, and so I didn't really have a chance to do a video. But this week, having been back in town, I've had a chance to sit down and sift through some of the articles that have been published, particularly in the mainstream press, regarding the Reformation. And what I found really didn't surprise me a whole lot. And a lot of it is, well, let's just say it's not exactly friendly to the Reformation. Here's a few examples from the mainstream press. These are all articles, or most of the articles that are going to follow here, are from the mainstream press, things that have been published here for the most part this past week. Some of them actually date back about a year. But I think all of them, you see a very similar thread that runs through them all, and that is that there's a general hostility, surprise, surprise, in the mainstream press to the Reformation, to the doctrines of grace. The first article I'd like to take a look at here, this is actually from The Atlantic. It has a title, Why Can't Christians Get Along? 500 Years After the Reformation. Martin Luther left behind a rich legacy of protest and reform, but the global church, notice the global church, the globalists, they have to import that even into their reporting on Reformation Day. The global church still isn't over the fractures he helped create. So, yeah, it was a terrible thing that Martin Luther did, and it was all his fault. And, well, Protestants should just repent of their sins and get with the program. But anyway, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. Here's there's this interesting idea that's been published out there in the mainstream press that for some reason we're being told now that Martin Luther did not nail his 95 Theses to the church door. And this is a repeated theme that runs through a number of these articles in the MSM. Let me just read to you the beginning of this particular article. Elizabeth Eaton is in a bit of a bind. Exactly 500 years ago, on October 31st, Martin Luther allegedly nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a German church, decrying the Catholic Church's abusive sale of indulgences or reprieves from punishment for sins. Now you notice the word here, allegedly. So in this article, just right at the very beginning, I mean, you see a number of problems with the MSM. You see Roman Catholics and Protestants identified as Christians. You see that Martin Luther created a fracture in the church. You see globalism imported, and you even see feminism, because this particular article talks about Elizabeth Eaton. And Elizabeth Eaton is later on identified down here as, okay, yeah, she's a bishop in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So you get feminism too. It's amazing how blatant the attack on the Reformation can be, just in the headline in the first paragraph of this article. But notice that again, the word allegedly, and they give you a link, and that link actually takes us to an article in the New Yorker. This is an article from October 30th, 2017. So again, this is something that was just from last week. And according to this article in the New Yorker, it talks about a lot of recent scholarship on Martin Luther and the Reformation. Here's what it says. It says that these recent authors, they said they differ on many points, but something that most of them agree on is the hammering episode, so satisfying symbolically, loud, metallic, violent, never occurred. Not only were there no eyewitnesses, Luther himself, ordinarily an enthusiastic self-dramatizer, was vague on what happened. He remembered drawing up a list of 95 theses around the date in question, but as for what he did with it, all he was sure of was that he sent it to a local archbishop. So, that whole thing, nailing the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, well, that's kind of an urban myth, and that's actually what the Huffington Post called it. They had a little video that they made on their website about Reformation and the Reformation Day, and they referred to Luther's nailing of the 95 Theses as an urban myth. astounding, but that's what they said. Another example from the mainstream media, this is an article from the Washington Post. This is from October 31st, so this is actually Reformation Day here. And it was interesting. They call it the original viral post. And I guess in a lot of ways that is, isn't it? That's really true. We talk about a video or a blog post or something going viral. Well, what Martin Luther did was the 16th century's version of going viral. But even in this particular article, they raised this question. Martin Luther shook the world 500 years ago, but did he nail anything to a church door? And reading through this article here, just read through the first paragraph. On October 31st, 1517, an obscure German professor of theology named Martin Luther launched an attack on the Roman Catholic Church by nailing his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg's Castle Church, a story that's been repeated for hundreds of years. Luther's act of rebellion led to the Protestant Reformation, which is being marked by millions of Christians around the world Tuesday on its 500th anniversary. But did that dramatic moment, Luther defiantly hammering his critique to the church door, really happen? Well, it identifies here as Philip Melanchthon as the first person who told the story. And then they go on here to cite this fellow by the name of Erwin Isserloh. He was identified in 1961. It says Erwin Isserloh, a Catholic Luther researcher, argued that there was no evidence that Luther actually nailed his 95 Theses to the castle door. Indeed, at the 1617 celebration of the Reformation, Luther was depicted as writing the 95 Theses on the church door with a quill. So, they cite a Roman Catholic scholar who says that Luther never nailed his 95 Theses to the church door. However, this Washington Post article, and in all fairness to the Washington Post, I think this article is of the mainstream stories that question Luther's act on October 31st, 1517. They're actually more fair. And it's very interesting here that below the headline and below this Catholic scholar's critique of Luther is this paragraph, and I'll read that to you. It says, a decade ago, Martin Troy, and I believe this fellow is German, so I'm going to try to pronounce his name in proper German, that Martin Troy, who works for the Luther Memorials Foundation of Saxony-Anhalt, discovered a handwritten note by Luther's secretary, Gregory Rohr, made in a revised copy of the New Testament before Luther's death. It reads, quote, on the evening before All Saints' Day in the year of our Lord, 1517, theses about letters of indulgences were nailed to the doors of Wittenberg churches by Dr. Martin Luther. So this particular note from someone who knew Martin Luther personally actually says that he nailed it to multiple church doors. So this actually really supports the idea that Luther, in fact, did nail his theses to the Wittenberg church door. But you have to read through the article to actually get to that point. It's kind of interesting. Well, there's some other fake news that's put out by the fake news MSM. One of those is, of course, the idea that Roman Catholics are Christians. And you can see that, for instance, we looked at that original article, the first article, I should say, that was in the Atlantic, and it has the headline, Why Can't Christians Get Along? Why can't we all get along? I guess that's maybe Rodney King theology. So, you got Roman Catholic Christians, you've got Protestant Christians, and we all just need to get along. And that's a very common message that runs throughout the MSM's coverage. When I say the MSM, by the way, I mean the mainstream media. The mainstream media's coverage of the Reformation, because we're all just Christians, just maybe a little different varieties. Christianity's it's like Heinz ketchup, right? It's 57 varieties. And we're all basically pretty much the same, and we all just need to learn how to get along. This is an article here from The Guardian. Now, this is actually last year, it was October 29th, 2016, so it was right around the Reformation Day last year in 2016, and the title of this particular article is, After 500 Years of Schism, Will the Rift of the Reformation Finally Be Healed? And, of course, you go through here, and as you read through it, you get this idea that that Roman Catholics are Christians, and it's sometimes very subtle. Sometimes it's said outright, but Roman Catholics are Christians, and we all just need to learn how to get along. For instance, it gives a quote here. It says, Christian leaders and congregations will spend the next 12 months consolidating moves toward greater cooperation and dialogue after centuries of division. So Christian leaders, and of course, as the article makes clear, that's referring to both Protestants and Roman Catholics. Yeah, in the first papal visit to Sweden in more than 25 years, Francis, that's Pope Francis, will lead prayers asking, quote, forgiveness for divisions perpetrated by Christians from the true tradition. So you see, you've got Roman Catholic Christians, you've got Protestant Christians, and again, we all need to kind of learn how to get along. There's an article also, and this goes back from last year, from 2016. This one happens to appear in NPR, and it says, NPR's Sylvia Poggioli reports that the trip, and it's talking about the Pope's trip to Sweden, is, quote, in keeping with his efforts to reach out to other branches of Christianity, like the Russian Orthodox Church, and other faiths, including Islam and Judaism, end quote. So Pope Francis' outreach to the Lutherans is, again, it's just his little way of reaching out to other branches of Christianity. So, of course, that implies that Romanism is Christianity. And of course, I guess Lutheranism is too. And maybe if you're a Presbyterian or a Baptist or some other Protestant, well, maybe you're a Christian too. And we're all Christians, and we all just need to learn how to get along with each other. And finally, the third item that I wanted to talk about here tonight is that idea that the Reformation is a tragedy that ought to be reversed. This is something that you see quite frequently and we've already seen it in some of the articles that we've looked at. But it's something that it's a common theme that runs throughout, again, the MSM's coverage. For instance, take a look here. This is an article from the Huffington Post, and it has the headline, Catholics and Protestants mark 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's Reformation. And here's, again, the very first paragraph. And one of the things that's interesting when you read through these things, the first paragraph, even the headline really, is a dead giveaway as to the editorial stance of the article. And in fact, I just noticed this here in this article. Centuries later, these two Christian groups are working toward unity. So again, you have this identification as Roman Catholics and Protestants as both just being two branches of Christianity. But down here's the first paragraph of this article. 500 years after German theologian Martin Luther published a diatribe. Now, a diatribe is abusive speech or writing. So Martin Luther's 95 Theses, not only did he not nail them to the church door, but those theses, they're a diatribe. And, for no particular good reason, they're a diatribe against some of the practices of the Catholic Church. And Catholics and Lutherans mark the historic anniversary with a strong display of unity. So you see that whole Reformation thing, well, golly, it was just a great big mistake. We need to get together and have a big group hug. What do they say? I guess get together and sing Kumbaya, something like that. And as it goes down here, and it quotes the Pope, and he says, oh, actually, excuse me, this is a statement. This is a statement that was issued by both the Vatican and by the Lutheran group. And it says here, quote, Likewise, we beg forgiveness for our failures, and for the ways in which Christians have wounded the body of the Lord and offended each other during the 500 years since the beginning of the Reformation until today. So really, we need to get together and all have a great big group hug. And if you happen to be a Protestant, well, you really ought to apologize to the Pope, because we've been spending 500 years just abusing one another over silly doctrines like, I don't know, justification by belief alone. But really what we see is again, we see the MSM, the mainstream media, attempting a fake news campaign to confuse people. It tries to cast doubt on the idea of whether Martin Luther ever nailed his 95 Theses to the church door. It throws fog on the whole Christian faith by claiming that Roman Catholics and Protestants are both Christians, and it portrays the Reformation as a tragedy.